My name is Juliana Nykolaiszyn, and today is Wednesday, July 2nd, 2014, and I'm in Stillwater, Oklahoma, interviewing Dr. Ron Tyrl as part of the O State Stories Oral History Project. Thank you for joining me today.
Okay. My pleasure to be interviewed.
Dr. Tyrl, could you start off and tell me when you were born and where you were born?
Okay. In terms of birth, I'm an Okie by birth. I was born in Lawton, Oklahoma in June 1943, June 16th. My father was in the military at Fort Sill, and my mother was there in Lawton for that period of time. Even though I was born in Oklahoma, I call Missouri home. I was essentially raised in the Kansas City, Missouri area, and my wife accuses me of having come home to Oklahoma to die.
Well, how long was your family in Fort Sill?
Just a short period of time. My father was shipped overseas shortly after my birth, and my mother moved back to Missouri, which was her home as well. So I was there for less than a year.
Okay. Around what part of Missouri?
Just north of Kansas City, a small rural community, Hamilton, Missouri.
Okay.
And
so let's talk about young Ron growing up as a youth. Can you kind of describe the schools you attended for me?
Okay. I attended a suburban Kansas City, Missouri school. It's called Southwest High School. It had 1,000 students, and at that time, grades were 8 through 12, or 8 through senior. So you had didn't have the division of students in terms of age that we have now. So 1,000 students. I don't really remember much about high school. It was just something that I went through. I was a middling student, I think. When I turned 16, I went to work for Safeway grocery stores, and that became really the focus of my life, working for Safeway, the people that I worked with, I socialized with, and so forth. And I graduated 100th in my class of 400, and then went on to college.
Well, as you were growing up and working for Safeway, did you have career aspirations?
My career aspirations were to follow my father into the business world. My father also worked for Safeway as a district manager, and I envisioned myself entering the Safeway hierarchy of management. And when I started college, I was a business major. And then I took my first 2 classes in business in college, an accounting class and an economics class, and 3 classes, general business class, and decided that wasn't for me.
And where did you attend college?
I went to a small liberal arts college, Park College, which was located on the north side of Kansas City. It had at that time, about 800 students.
So your early collegiate career, your business classes, at some point you switched gears.
Yes. That's when, as I say, when I took those 3 classes and I just couldn't get excited about them, my undergraduate academic advisor was a botanist by training, a plant taxonomist. Took biology, introductory biology, and discovered I loved it, and got enthused about academic work and discovered that I, not to be tooting my own horn, but I could make the dean's list, and I was enjoying the science, and switched from business to biology and became a biology major, emphasizing botany or plants.
And growing up, were you ever drawn to nature or the outdoors?
Indirectly. My favorite department working for Safeway was in the produce department. Coming in early in the morning, setting up the racks of vegetables and fruits, and so perhaps the inklings of my interest in plants were revealed by that interest in working in the produce section.
And so after you made your switch to biology and botany. What did you hope to do?
At that time, I was learning just for the joy of learning. I was a biology major. There was a group of biology majors. In fact, my wife was a biology major. She was interested in zoology. We went on, in fact, we met on a field trip to Florida between our sophomore and junior years. It was a 2-week-long trip to see the ecology of the area. And just was enjoying learning about plants and animals for the joy of learning. I hadn't thought about what my future career would be or anything like that. I was just getting a liberal arts education at the time. And then when I got to be a senior, my academic advisor suggested, why don't you think about graduate school? And I said, what's graduate school? You know, I had no idea in the world where PhDs came from, or masters, people with master's degrees came from. And so by this time, my future wife and I were talking about plans and what we might do. She had taken a job, she graduated before I did, and had taken a job in a virus research lab at the KU Med Center. And we were thinking about getting married as soon as I finished my degree. And we looked into graduate schools, and I had the opportunity to go to UCLA, to Oregon State, or to the University of Washington in botany, and especially plant taxonomy. And so we got married. I worked for Coca-Cola for 9 months, and then we decided on Oregon. And so I started graduate school, again, just learning for the joy of learning without really thinking about what the future was going to be.
And the Pacific Northwest has a very diverse
flora.
Yeah.
Very, very, and quite different from what we have here in Oklahoma. But it turned out to be the ideal place for me to study. My major professor there was a dynamic individual and was an excellent mentor. And then he was the curator of the herbarium, the position which I held here before I retired. And the assistant curator was a woman who, I have to admit, she terrified me at the very beginning so much I often called her sir. You know, she'd tell me something to do, I'd say, yes, sir, and then I'd correct myself. But she taught me so much about plant taxonomy. She was the author of several books dealing with the plants of the Pacific Northwest. And the things that she taught me, as well as my major professor, the things that I've used professionally for 40 years now. So we were out at Oregon State. I did my master's there, and I decided, well, I'll go ahead and get the PhD, because the work I was doing evolved into a dissertation. And so I did my master's there, and then my doctorate there, and then, well, what am I going to do? Well, the people at Park College, where I did my undergraduate work, had a position come open, and they invited me to apply to be an assistant professor there at Park in biology, to teach botany, which was my major, and my 2 minors were microbiology and genetics. So it worked out, and I went back to Park College in January of 1970.
Going back for a second, your research focus at Oregon State revolved around?
A group of plants called yarrow. It's a member, we have it here in Oklahoma. It's Achillea millefolium, a member of the sunflower family. It was quite an important plant during the Civil War because it has a lot of aromatic compounds in it, and the leaves are very leaf-like or fern-like and can be used as packing in wounds. In fact, one of its common names is woundwort, and those compounds in it will also have antimicrobial actions and so forth. But I was interested in its evolutionary history in Western North America and how 2 different subspecies or varieties that had different chromosome numbers had interacted and how they might have come about in North America. So my wife and I collected plants from British Columbia all the way down to Baja, California. We went all the back roads of Washington, Oregon, and California. And it was a glorious time doing all that work. And collected the plants, brought them back to the lab, analyzed their chromosomes, and then developed a hypothesis as to what happened in terms of the evolution of the genus in North America. And that, as I say, first I started out just looking at Achillea in Oregon, and then what I found in Oregon suggested you needed to look at all of the western edge of North America. So we did that.
And did you have any time to gain experience teaching in the classroom?
Before I started teaching at Park College, I had never been in the classroom, other than as a student. I seem to remember one class going in and helping my major professor lay out plants, but I did no formal teaching prior to my arrival at Park College. So in January of 1970, I walked in and I had 3 classes to teach: botany, genetics, and plant systematics. So that was my introduction there.
Was that a very interesting transition for you or was it more of a natural progression?
One, it wasn't a transition in terms of learning.
Right.
Because, as I said, as an undergraduate and even as a graduate student, I was doing it more just for the enjoyment rather than thinking of future career plans. But then it was a rather remarkable transition in that I felt like I was learning things for the very first time when I had to get up and explain to someone else a particular topic, describe in terms they could understand the process of photosynthesis, the process of evolution, or something like that. Learning something and taking a test is one thing, and getting up and being able to talk about it and explain it to others is something more entirely. And so that was even a more exciting time. I was just going 24 hours a day trying to get things worked out. And I discovered I had a knack at being able to communicate to students and so forth. So it was fun. Enjoyed it.
How long were you at Park?
All right. I was at Park from December of 1970, January of 1970 to August of 1972. Park at that time was undergoing some financial problems, and as the low man on the totem pole, I was anticipating that if they had to start letting people go, I needed to be thinking about where I might go after Park. And at that time, a fellow graduate student at Oregon State who'd taken a job down at the University of Oklahoma, and we've collaborated the rest of our professional careers, he suggested I apply for the job here. And so I wrote a letter giving my background and applying for the position here, and ended up here, was offered the position in May of 1972, and we moved down here in August, and I started down here.
What were your first impressions of Stillwater in 1972?
Stillwater is almost exactly like Corvallis in Oregon. In fact, the 2 schools, OSU and OSU, both have orange and black as their colors. OSU, Oregon, of course, being the Beavers, and we're the Cowboys. But Corvallis and Stillwater are essentially the same sort of town. The university is the main industry in town. The town kind of revolves around the activities of the university. So it wasn't a total shock. As people, that come from a big city or somewhere else, even Tulsa or Oklahoma City experience. So it was quite enjoyable. We found a place right over here on the west side of campus in College Gardens. I don't know if you've ever been over there, but time between my office and the front doorstep was 5 minutes on a bicycle. I didn't have to buy a parking pass. Well, I never did, come to think of it, because when I retired, I got my complimentary emeritus pass, so I never had to buy a parking pass or worry about parking on campus. And if I felt like getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, couldn't go back to sleep, I'd bicycle up here to work and work for a couple hours and then go home and eat breakfast and shave and shower and get dressed and come back to work. So Stillwater was a very nice town to live in. We're happy that our kids grew up here. My oldest son and his family surprised us by saying they wanted to move back to Stillwater, and they're in the process of doing so now, just because it's such a nice place to live.
And how many children do you have?
We have one boy who's now 44, and then we have twins who are 42. And all three of them, as I say, grew up here in Stillwater and call Stillwater their home. My oldest boy lives in Tulsa with his 2 children, and then the twins are both out in California. My daughter's married to a Navy commander, and they live in San Diego and have 2 boys. And then my son, he and his husband live in Orange County, and he's followed me into the teaching profession. He's just earned his master's in theatrical arts and is now teaching at Cal State Fullerton. And he has discovered that, just like me, he discovers that he had a knack for communication in the classroom. So of the 3, he's the only one that has done that. So.
Well, in the 1970s, tell me a little bit about the Botany Department here at OSU.
When I came from Park to Stillwater, it was the Botany and Plant Pathology Department. John Thomas was the head. He's the individual who hired me. And there was, I would say, roughly about 16 or 17 faculty. Half were plant pathologists and were supported primarily through the College of Agriculture. The remaining half, there was 1 plant taxonomist, that was me. There was 2 plant physiologists, 1 plant anatomist, 1 plant ecologist. Seems like there was someone else there that I'm forgetting. And so it was essentially 2 different departments with 2 different missions united into a single department. There are very few botany and plant pathology departments left in the country today, but at that time we were one. And you had some people that were relatively old and full professors, and some were associate professors and some were assistant professors. We used to get together at 10 o'clock in the morning up in one of the labs and have coffee for 15 to 20 minutes or so. And one of the most remarkable things that I remember from those coffee times where they were talking about someone from physics being appointed at that time the Dean of Research instead of Vice President. At that time it was the Dean of Research. And some of the old timers were saying, well, I don't know if he's been around long enough to really know how the university works. And someone else, keep in mind this was my first year here. I'd been here about 3 months. And someone else said, well, yeah, he's only been here 10 years. And they were thinking that these were newcomers, and I'm thinking, well, what do they think of me? And I've only been here less than a year, and so forth. But it was a very congenial group. We had our social events at Christmas time, and a spring picnic and a fall picnic, as when the new graduate students would arrive, we'd have a departmental picnic so that everyone would get to know them. I was a replacement for a fellow by the name of U.T. Waterfall. He was the curator of the herbarium before me. He had earned his doctorate at OU, and had come here in 1948 or so, and he started to work on a manual for the identification of the state's plants. And unfortunately, he died of cancer in 1971. And so they had an interview process, and I was one of the 3 candidates that came in for the position. And so I was expected to teach plant taxonomy, and because I had a minor in genetics at Oregon State, I also was expected to teach a cytogenetics course, mainly for the people in agronomy. And then and a course on grasses, agrostology, the biology of grasses, which turned out to be my favorite plant family now. But I replaced Waterfall, and I was also expected to finish his book on the flora of Oklahoma. He'd written Keys, and it was being used by students all over the state, but he hadn't written the technical descriptions and so forth. And when I saw the manuscript, it was a case of where it really needed to be start over. The way he had done it was not compatible with the way most manuals for plant identification are written. So I kind of put it on the back burner and didn't get back to it for a number of years. But that was the department. Then 2 years after I was here, 74, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Dean Grease, decided that we needed to reorganize the biological sciences. And so the Department of Microbiology, the Department of Botany, plant pathology was split off and went to the College of Agriculture. So botany, microbiology, and zoology were all lumped together. We were told to reorganize in some fashion. And the idea of break down barriers into, the buzzword of today, multidisciplinary approaches and so forth. Well, I went through about 6 or 7 different departments. I was in a faculty of ecology for a while. I was in a faculty of biology and evolutionary biology for a while. They weren't really departments as such. We had one, it was a school. And some of those vestiges still, there's a school of communications, and there was a school for several departments in sociology. Most of them have been disbanded. But there was a school with a fellow by the name of Glenn Todd as the department head. And so we went through all these faculties. People across the table at faculty meetings would change. The issues never changed. It was still kind of like one big department with sub-disciplines. It'd be like the library, and then all the social sciences and natural sciences and humanities and so forth, all under the dean of the library. So it was that way. But there was this constant turmoil. I don't know how many hours I spent in faculty meetings developing this, developing that. And as you might imagine, faculty personalities got into it. And there were some people that refused to give up their own discipline. The microbiologists especially, there were 3 or 4 people that, nope, we have to keep biology as a distinct entity and so forth. And then, eventually, when Grease retired, Dean Smith Holt came in, and we went back to departments. And so it was the zoology department, microbiology department, botany department. And then there were problems among the administrators with microbiology. And so the dean put botany and microbiology together. And we were essentially 2 faculties with 1 department head. We botanists carried on, the microbiologists carried on, and we came together once in a while. So that's really I wish I'd kept track of how many different entities my name was attached to, because there were a lot of them.
A lot of changes.
Yeah, there was organismal and ecological at one time. And then, see, part of the problem, there were a number of us, myself included, we were really fit in several different departments. You know, I could be an organismal because I study individual plants, or I could be in ecology because the work I was doing at the time was used by the ecologists. So a lot of energy was expended. So, and the wheel came around and so forth.
And today it's just the Botany Department.
Pardon? Today it's just the Botany Department.
Okay.
Linda Watson is the department head. Botany used to occupy, in this building, when I came, occupied the first floor, most of the second floor. The dean only had a suite of offices at the very end of the building. Now he has the whole floor. Part of the third floor and part of the fourth floor. The herbarium used to be on the fourth floor up in the corner and so forth. And then with Peter Sherwood, the dean before the one we have now, he decided he wanted, not in addition to the second floor, he also wanted the first floor. And so all of botany, which used to be on the first floor, ended up over in the chemical and the physical science building, and part of the faculty moved into the new Noble Research Center. And then those of us in the basement, we stayed down here. So in reality, I think botany came out ahead by that because they got new labs, more space over in the physical science building, and they had an opportunity to move into the new multidisciplinary Noble Research Center. As you can tell, I'm a little bit jaded by administrative actions at OSU, but I guess they're the same everywhere. It's nice to have, I can top your story in terms of administrative horrors.
How were your facilities when you first started? You mentioned the upgrade now, but...
All right. When I first came, I was so excited when I walked into my office, which was on the first floor, and found an IBM Selectric typewriter. Because I had never had an electric typewriter before. All I had was an old R.C. Allen manual typewriter. And so I was pleased. The herbarium, the specimens were, my predecessor, Waterfall, was a great field person, great collector, but he had those specimens so crammed in the cases you couldn't put any more specimens in, and you'll have an opportunity to see that shortly. And so I told them, in fact, that was one of the things I noticed when I applied for the position. When I looked at the herbarium, I said, this is unacceptable. You can't have this. There's no room to grow, and the specimens are poorly curated. We're going to have to increase the size of the herbarium. Well, the department head, John Thomas at the time, took that to heart, and whenever he could find money to buy more herbarium cabinets for me, storage cabinets, he did so. He found, at that time, the Missouri Botanical Garden, that was 73, was doing away with their standard herbarium cabinets and putting in what are called compactors. You may have seen those in library science, where they're shelves on rollers and they all squeeze up, so there's essentially just one aisle open at a time. All right, well, they were putting those in. They were selling at a ridiculously low price of $30 a cabinet, all the cabinets. You had to go up and get them, dismantle them, and bring them back. John Thomas made arrangements with agronomy, or animal science, for me to borrow a cattle truck, and my graduate student and I drove the cattle truck to St. Louis and disassembled those cabinets, had to take the doors off, because these are old-fashioned steel cabinets, unload the doors, loaded them into the cattle truck. We made 3 trips. And hauled them down here and reassembled them. They stretched, when we unloaded the truck, they stretched from Life Science East across to the center mall out there. We had them all stacked up before we could put them in the elevator to get them to the 4th floor. And so John Thomas was good about whenever he could help me out. He provided at that time work study, where the university paid 5% and federal program paid the other 95%. He supplied me with unlimited work study people. And so we made all new folders for the specimens, mounted, we numbered the specimens so we knew exactly how many we had. At that time we had about 130,000 specimens. We now have about 150,000 specimens. Okay, so in terms of the teaching, we didn't have the fee for technology development and so forth, so we were still using scopes that had been bought. Well, in fact, some of the scopes that are still used in field botany, my signature course, dated from before I came, dated from the 60s. They're still in good shape. There's nothing wrong with them. But, we didn't have the latest development. But you don't necessarily need the latest in equipment in order to be a successful teacher, I think. In fact, I think that's part of the problem. So much is done on the computer with modeling and so forth. My predecessor in teaching general botany didn't have any living plants in the lab. How can you teach a course in plants if you're not looking at live plants? So sorry, I'm digressing.
Well, you mentioned early on the 3 courses that OSU wanted you to teach. What are some of the other courses you've taught during your career? Okay.
I used to teach, when I came, I taught plant taxonomy every semester. That's Botany 3014, and that was designed as a course in identification for biology majors, for range managers, agronomists, foresters, horticulturalists, just a general, anyone who needs to know how to identify plants. And so I taught that every semester. I taught a course in grasses, agristology, mainly for the fish and wildlife people and the range managers. In fact, half of the class were from agriculture and half were from fish and wildlife, which was part of zoology at the time. And I'd come in and tell a wildlifer joke one day and come in and tell a range manager joke the next day and so forth. But anyway, so I taught those 2 courses, and then an ecologist by the name of James McPherson, he had been hired about 3 years before me, suggested that we teach a very practical course called field botany, based on a course that he'd taken as a graduate student at Santa Barbara. And we started this field botany course that involved 4 weekend field trips to the 4 corners of the state, the lectures and labs. It was a very practical course. How do you identify this plant? Pick up that plant, be able to describe it, and tell me what it is. And we team taught that for a decade. And I'm proud to say, I think that was one of the most successful courses that's ever been taught at OSU. Because if you look at the people in field fish and wildlife here in the state, and Army Corps of Engineers, and federal fish and wildlife people, most of them have taken field botany. I don't know if you ever watched OTA in the Sunday mornings, and Todd Craighead does a wildlife thing, sort of thing. He was a field botany graduate. So we taught that together. Then I was asked to come back and take over the general botany course at the time, biology 1114 at the time, because they weren't happy with what was being done there. So I took that over, dropped field botany until McPherson retired in '92, and then I came back and took it over again and taught it by myself. And that's where the book with Bellamy Parks Jansen's came. The book really represents the notes that Jim McPherson and I used to give the students as we were out in the field. Field botany used to be called Botany Ride and Run because McPherson would go along talking about the ecology of the area, and then as soon as he'd take a breath, I'd start talking about the ecology of the plants or the characteristics of the plant. And at that time, the students were writing it all down on little notepads that they carried with them. And as I say, we did 4 weekend trips, Saturday, Sunday.
Where did you take your trips?
To the 4 corners of the state. Because you can, in Oklahoma, I don't know, where do you call home?
Florida.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. If you go down to the southeast corner of the state, around Idabel and Broken Arrow, there will be species that you'll recognize from Florida. Southeastern U.S. species reach their northwestern limits down in southeastern Oklahoma. Ball cypress, southern wild rice, a whole slew of things are down. Palmetto, they're all down there in the southeast. So you could go there and get a sampling of the southeastern corner of the U.S. Go to the northeast corner, over here east of Tulsa, Tahlequah, I don't know if you've been Grand Lake, that area, up onto the Ozark Plateau. You have species characteristic of New England reaching their southwestern distributional limits in the state. And so you can get a sample of what New England looks like, the plants of New England. Go to the southwest, and you have plants of the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts reaching their northeastern limits. Cacti, mesquite, all these things that we associate with the desert can be found in southwestern Oklahoma. Go to the end of the panhandle, that accident of geography and politics. You've got species characteristic of the Rocky Mountains getting into the state. Pinyon pine, ponderosa pine get into the state by 2 or 3 miles, and they're out there. One-seeded juniper, which is a Rocky Mountain species. And then in the center of the state, we have species that can be found in Canada or be found in the Gulf of Mexico, the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. They all come together in the state. It's really, for our size, it's tremendous diversity in the state. And taking these 4 weekend field trips and asking the students, we got up to where they had to be able to recognize about 200 species, genera, and family on site. Be able to say, oh, that's got square stem, opposite leaves, bilaterally symmetrical flowers, that's a member of the mint, and 4 nutlets, that's a member of the mint family. Or that's a member of the grass family, or that's a member of the sedge family. And be able to do that from a practical standpoint. And if you think about it, a range manager who's out there talking to a rancher in western Oklahoma that's worried about a particular plant, he's expecting that range manager to be able to say, oh, that's Senecio rodellii, that's toxic. And if you've been having trouble with losing cattle, they've been eating that. So that was field botany, and that's the course that I'm most proud of, and I call my signature course. Because and my greatest joy as a teacher is when I have someone come up and say, I took field botany from you in such and such a year, and I hated it at the time, but it's been ideal. I've had students that said, you taught my mom and dad. They met in field botany. That's okay. And they're taking the course and so forth. But so that was field botany, and those weekend field trips, we had a complete set of camping gear. We had organized the students into groups of 6 or so. They were issued a cook set, a tent, a stove, a lantern, a 5-gallon carboy for drinking water, fuel, everything they needed to camp out. All they had to do was bring their own food and their bedrolls. And we even supplied Army mummy bags if they didn't have their own sleeping bag. And so we left at 6 o'clock on Saturday morning. We botanized all day long. We camped at one of the state parks, had dinner, and then to keep things under control, on Sunday morning, we got up at 6 o'clock, ate breakfast, and then we started to botanize again. And all the plants they'd learned on Saturday, we had quizzes on them. But anyway, all that leads up to, we had them writing notes all the time. Well, then when I started doing it by myself, in order to remember what I wanted to say about each plant and the ecology and so forth, and to speed things up, I started giving them 3x5 cards. I'd say, all right, this is Helianthus annuus, and I'd hand them a 3x5 card, and they would keep it, and then they could use it. And a lot of times they'd take Scotch tape and tape a snippet of the plant to the back of it to help them remember it. They collected bags and put them in plastic bags. We carried ice chests with ice in them so they could keep them cool and so forth. And then, so I was accumulating. Then I started putting it into a 5.5 by 8 notebook. And instead of handing them out a card each time, I just, at the beginning of the semester, gave them this notebook. And then they could look at it and jot notes, additional things in it, and so forth. And then 2 of my former students, range managers, and one was a range manager, one was a female, said, why don't you put this into a book? And I don't know. So they talked me into doing it. And so the 3 of us, they added more information about the wildlife significance and the range management aspects and so forth. And that was the first edition of the field guide. And Bellamy Parks Jansen, somehow I'd learned about her as an illustrator. And I started corresponding with her, and I would send her herbarium specimens and tell her what I wanted the illustration to look like, send them. She and I worked together for 18 years before we met.
Wow.
When we started, she lived in Indiana, then she lived in Nebraska, and then she ended up in Colorado before we met. And then a number of years ago, we had a special, very first of the Botany Spring Lectures. Were you here for that?
I was.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Well, then you heard that part of the story then. Mm-hmm. So that, what was your original question?
Oh, classes you taught.
Okay, so there was field botany, and then I did general botany, introductory botany. I'd have anywhere about 150 students a semester in that. Field botany, the most we ever had when Jim and I were teaching it at a time was 70, and we had to run each field trip twice. So there were 8 weekends gone in the fall. My wife hated falls because the weekends I didn't have field trips, usually had meetings to go to, like at the Missouri Botanical Garden or something like that, or the Oklahoma Academy of Science. But most of the time, then when we got to the point, we couldn't drive. We bought used school buses, and McPherson and I would drive those school buses. And then the university wouldn't pay for any more used school buses. So then started renting Bob and having a driver, and that life got good again. I wasn't so exhausted after driving for a whole weekend, plus lecturing. Usually by Sunday evening, I didn't have any voice at all left. And McPherson, he didn't have any voice. Because trying to project your voice out to 40 students out in the wilds with the wind blowing and having everyone hear you and so forth, practically yelling the whole time. So I did that, field and general botany. I continued to teach cytogenetics. Then when our plant anatomist morphologist retired, they needed someone to teach plant diversity. And so I took on plant diversity. And that's where looking at everything but flowering plants, looking at algae and ferns and mosses and liverworts and so forth, kind of the evolution of plants. So I was doing that until the time I retired. And then for a while there, when we were one big school, I taught a third of the upper division cell and molecular biology course. I know that sounds strange, but I taught the genetics part of it and the photosynthesis part of it, the plant part of it, and cytology part of it. It was team taught with 2 other individuals, a zoologist and a microbiologist. So, and then for fun, I've done like courses, did forensic botany just before I retired. What else have I done? I think that's about, those are the ones that I can remember. Oh, and then down in the summertime, I forgot, vascular aquatic plants. I used to teach a class in vascular aquatic plants, mainly through extension. I used to drive, this is back before the Cimarron Turnpike, drive over to southeast Oklahoma, or southeast Tulsa, to teach a night class for the Army Corps of Engineers and the Fish and Wildlife Service. I drove essentially 3.5 hours on Old 51 Highway, carried all the microscopes, and illuminators over, and all my plant material to teach from 7 to 9. To teach a 2-hour class, I spent 4 hours driving. Did that. And then I changed my allegiance in the summertime. The University of Oklahoma has a biological station on Lake Texoma. And they used to have an 8-week summer session down there. And I was invited to go down and teach. Well, in 75, I taught agristology. And then in 76, I taught vascular aquatic plants. And then in 77, I started field botany. And I did that for 24 years. My family, the 3 kids and wife and I, we moved down and lived in a 2-room apartment. The 2 rooms would have been roughly, if you imagine a partition right here in the middle of this lab that came over to here so you could walk around. There wasn't a door, just a partition, a bedroom and a living room. And we ate in the biological station cafeteria. And my kids learned to swim in a lake, not in a swimming pool. My wife didn't have to cook for 2 months. And those were some of the best years of our lives. It was June and July. Then we'd come home and usually went on a family vacation to Colorado with my wife's parents, camping. And we were gone August, then we'd come back, start the semester. But I did that down there and did a lot of my research down there because I only had to teach twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays, all day long, except when I scheduled the weekend field trips, Saturdays and Sundays. So,
not a bad way to spend the summer.
Not a bad way to spend the summer. In fact, our kids were at a disadvantage on some of those general knowledge tests that they take in grade school because those word associations, they wouldn't put down the right answers because like there would be summer sport of swimming and you're supposed to associate with that with pool. Well, lake wasn't there. And so they miss a bunch of these things, or they would write in the answers and the teachers didn't understand the answers because the kids collected insects. We had pet tarantulas, we had pet turtles. Morris was a pet turtle, snakes, all the things that kids can do. And there were a number of families. Generally, there were about 8 or 9 faculty families there. And so the kids played all day long. You could turn them out the front door and you didn't have to worry about them. Come in, they'd take naps and go for the afternoon swims down in the lake stuff. So, a lot of different teaching experiences. Back when I was at Park College, a class I always wanted to do here but never did, it was biological bibliography. Back in the days before computers, how do you get information out of indices and databases? You know, today everybody just you Google the term or the number you need or something like that. Well, in the olden days, you had to go to very specialized books if you wanted to know what the amount of DNA was in a flatworm or something like that. And also how to write scientific papers. And I think that's something that's been neglected in science today. Everyone assumes that they're learning it in some other course, but not necessarily. When I was teaching plant biology. I know the students hated it, but I felt it was the only way to do it. You know, sometimes they only have to write a single paper, and if it's good or bad, they either get a bad. Well, every lab period, they had to write up part of it as a regular scientific paper. Like 1 week they'd have to write the introduction, background and objectives. And then the next week they might have to, for the experiment they did, they'd have to write the materials and methods. Then the next week they'd have to write the results. And then the next week they'd have to graph something. You know, they got how to write a scientific paper, not in just one shot. They got it spread out over the entire semester. And so they got feedback so that when we got to the end and they had to turn in a single paper,
it was already done.
It was already, they should have known how to do it. Not always did that work, but the good students, I think, appreciated it. So.
What year did you retire?
Okay, technically I retired in May 2008. I've been retired 6 years and 2 months. I still come in because, I tell people, I'm still coming in because I didn't get the stuff done that I should have gotten done before I retired. But I still come in most days for 2 or 3 hours to try to get some of the projects done. Like since I've retired, I've finished the second edition of Toxic Plants of North America. Oh, I forgot that. I used to teach part of a course on toxicology out at the vet school with my colleague George Burroughs. He and I did first a series of papers on toxic plants, kind of like the field guide, and then we put together a little booklet titled Toxic Plants of Oklahoma and the Southern Great Plains, and that was so well received, someone said, well, why don't you do Toxic Plants of North America? And so we did the first edition of that, which came out in 2001. And then 11 years went by, and we get a call saying we'd like to have a second edition. So in 2011, we started the second edition, and it was supposed to be shorter. Well, it turned out being longer. We finished that up. We finished it. It's got a 2013 copyright date on it, but we finished it in December of 2012. So I've done that. Then the Flora of Oklahoma, what I was charged to do when I came to finish UT Waterfalls, I came back from a sabbatic leave and found I had been elected chair of the Flora of Oklahoma editorial committee in my absence.
Surprise. And
so I'm the coordinating editor of the project. I do write the first drafts, and then a committee of 12, well, we've had people die and other people come on board, so we're generally a committee of 11 or 12. We have to agree on every word, every sentence, every phrase, and so forth. If you can imagine,
that's a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
And we only meet once a month, all day on Saturday. That's why we're still working on it. But I'm hoping my last hurrah is going to be this next edition that will come out in January of 2015. And then I'm going to say somebody else can do it. I've done enough on it. But the nice thing about having a committee do that, every time we start to stray from our guiding principles that we set up at the very beginning, someone will say, oh, we said we couldn't do that. We said we weren't going to use that word. And what's interesting, in taxonomy, there are a lot of specialized terminology. Flamelliform, or is it first thing I think of, or symbiform. All right. If none of us in the group know that word, we say, we don't want to use that word. We're not even going to put it in the glossary, because if none of us knew it or understood it, and then other times we have the ridiculous discussion. We say, the petal color, the flower is rose. What color is rose? If I said rose, what's rose?
Well, it could be so many different colors.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Is it the bright American Beauty rose, the bright red, or is it more of does it have more purple in it, a deeper? So we say, all right, we can't use rose. We've got to come up with another term or something like that. So it's, in that sense, it's been worthwhile. And what's worst of all is when we're having these Saturdays meetings and we'll start hashing over some point and arguing about it. And all of us can remember, we've had this discussion before, but no one can remember what we decided before. Fortunately, having the manuscript with a global search, I'm able to go through and say, well, we've done it this way so many times. So I wish we started. The very first couplet, the very first words were written in November of 1992 on a blackboard down at the University of Oklahoma. We meet at OU because it's central. There's me here and Linda Watson, my department head here at OSU. There's used to be three people from Tulsa, University of Tulsa and TCC. There's one from Southeastern, there used to be one from Chickasha, there used to be one from Northwestern, there's one from OCU in Oklahoma City, one from East Central, one from OU, and our farthest person comes from Wichita Falls, at Midwestern University.
Wow.
So, but those first words were written in November of '92 on the blackboard in the General Taxonomy Lab at OU, and we it was a year later. We distributed it in taxonomy classes, our key to the plant families. We continued to use Waterfall's book, but his key had a lot of problems with it, so we rewrote the key and put it with Waterfall's book and started using it. And then each semester we would update it as the students would tell us of problems, things that didn't make sense or just weren't clear. We'd revise it and issue a new edition, and then as we added keys to the genera and keys to the species, we'd keep updating until we finally finished a few years ago a key to all the species. But we don't, and what we're working on now are descriptions. So we've been at it for 14 years. 14 years is coming November.
Wow.
But we only meet once a week, and the herbarium at OU is like the herbarium here. There's no windows to it. So we go in at 8 o'clock in the morning. It could be one type of weather, and when we come out at 5, it could be something entirely different. But it's been good. A lot of people often think, oh, I don't want to go. I want to stay home this weekend, and so forth. And then when I get there, I get to working. But also, at the end of the day, we're brain dead. Mm-hmm. Just the mental stress of trying to keep track of everything there. We tried doing it 2 or 3 days at a stretch to be more efficient. Instead of traveling, we all met and stayed in Norman for 2 nights. But by the 3rd day, we just couldn't function anymore. Mm-hmm. So
it's just too mentally taxing.
Mentally taxing.
Mm-hmm.
We went back.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the OSU herbarium.
Okay.
Let's start with what you know from the really early days of its inception.
Okay. We don't know exactly when the OSU herbarium started.
You're fine.
Right? Oh,
yeah.
Did I move?
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's okay.
We really don't know when it started. Traditionally, I've always said it started formally about 1920, and a fellow by the name of Robert Stratton, who was the curator at the time, started collecting specimens, I'm assuming started to buy the first cabinets. Collecting in the state actually started much earlier. A fellow by the name of G.W. Stevens in 1913 was up at Northwestern OSU. It was the normal teachers college at Alva at the time, I think, something like that. He, for his doctoral dissertation at Harvard, collected plants all over the state. And one set of duplicate specimens is here, another one's at OU, and another one's at Harvard, and others are all over the world. They were on exchange programs, exchanging the specimens. He collected a botanist by the name of Bogue, B-O-G-U-E, who was here. He was a professor of botany. He did a collection of vascular plants and ferns, so some of his specimens must have been incorporated. And there were some other people in those early days, all of them making surveys of various parts of the state, and so they undoubtedly collected plants and must have given them to the herbarium here. But Stratton was the first curator. He especially emphasized legumes, and some of the cabinets in there have got a plaque on them that say the Robert L. Stratton Collection of Legumes. And then a fella came along in 1925 by the name of High Featherly. Actually, it was Hiram I. Featherly. He always went by High, and he was an ecologist, taxonomist. He wrote the Manual of the Grasses of Oklahoma. It was an Ag Experiment Station publication. And he was the curator, and he collected a bunch of grasses and started incorporating student collections into the herbarium. And so I think the herbarium started to grow dramatically. The specimens were being deposited. And then, so he was curator for a number of years, and then Waterfall came along. And he was one of the ultimate collectors. The number of specimens, different plants that he collected were given, each specimen is given a unique number. And his collecting numbers were well over the 100,000. And he was set duplicate specimens everywhere, so he collected more than 100,000 individual specimens. So he's the one that really brought the collection up to its present size. And as I say, when we first started numbering, we could go in and look at the last specimens in there. I think it was about 130,000 or so. All right, and then I came along and I didn't do as much collecting, but I exchanged specimens. Most of the collections, about 80,000 sheets, are from Oklahoma. They're Oklahoma collections. The rest we've received on exchange from herbaria throughout the world. A lot from OU, a lot from the Smithsonian, just everywhere we've had an exchange program. Generally what that is, I'll give you a specimen, you give me a specimen in return. And then that way, herbarium starts to develop a sample of the world's flora. So that was the herbarium. As I say, originally we were on the 4th floor, had one big room up there of about 30 cases or so. And then when I came, and through the efforts of John Thomas, we got the money to double the size, essentially almost, double the size. And then in 1983, 83, when we had all that gas and oil money for renovation, not for new buildings. So what they did, they took some of that money. This was a crawl space when I came. The stairs you came down, there were only about 3 or 4 steps, and then it was all a mud crawl space, dirt floor in here. And you had to stoop down in order to clear the first floor, the ceiling of the first floor there. They had money to dig out the basement. So what we're in here is actually the basement, or was a crawl space that they came in with bobcats and dug out the basement. In fact, I was involved in drawing up the plans and so forth for down here to create more space. They couldn't build a new building, but they could renovate and expand. So that's how they did. And the basement has a lot of interesting features because of that. They didn't realize there were huge piers or pilings that support the building that had buttress bases around it. So where we had designed labs to fit in a certain space, all of a sudden there's a buttress base that you have to work around. And when we go in the herbarium, I'll show you how I solved that in the herbarium. So this was dug out to create space for additional space for the Botany Department and create new labs. At one time, it was going to connect via a tunnel to Life Science West. And underneath the driveway that's between Life Science West and Life Science East, that was all going to be offices and labs and so forth. Well, that didn't come to pass. But we got the basement. And so the basement was here, and they put in a new elevator and things like that. And then part of the idea was the herbarium, to gain more space, would move down here. And on the original plans that I drew up, the herbarium was to be this whole wing. When you came through those double doors into this wing, you were supposed to have come directly into the herbarium, and the offices would be all the way around, and there would be lots and lots of space. Well, what happened as they started constructing and so forth, physical plan says, oh, we have to have a big air handling room. And we lost half of the space here. That's why all this wasted hall space is out here. I designed it so that all the labs down here are designed where the offices are off the labs, so you don't waste space. You come into the lab and then go to the office, so you don't waste space with hallways. Well, they had to put in those hallways there. And then the rooms over next door, I'll show you when I take you on a tour, got smaller because, we have to put a big valve there. So they cut the room down 3 feet, built a false wall, so they have this big valve behind it. Another door in there is nothing more than a drip pipe that brings down the steam condensation lines, stops about that far from a drain in the floor and drips into the drain. I just saw my space disappearing. The advantage was we got to design the labs the way we wanted them. This isn't actually my office. My office used to be across the hall. I'll show it to you later. When I retired, I designed these labs or offices for my graduate students. So this is actually set up where 2 or even 3 students could be in there. And then that one had room for 2 in there. So, but that was the herbarium. Then the next big step with respect to the herbarium was databasing it. I was involved with a project, a collaborative project with OU. We received an NSF grant to database all of the Oklahoma specimens. So you can go to the Oklahoma Vascular Plants Database website, punch in the scientific name of a species, and it will pull up all of the herbarium specimens for all of the herbaria in the state. The ones, the specimens at OU or if it's OSU, TU, Panhandle State, there are specimens in there, any herbarium specimen. So you can plot out by county, the number of specimens of particular species. Or if you want to search what are all the species that occur in Payne County, you can key that in and it'll print you a list of all the things. The way we had to get at that before was to go through and look at the specimens one at a time. Like the card catalog. Mm-hmm. If you had to go through and go down the shelves one at a time looking for plants of Payne County,
Were they
A book,
organized in any particular way, or?
Alphabetically by scientific name.
Okay.
The key, the scientific name is the equivalent of the call number.
Okay.
All right. So, and then we had provisions for if they're annotated, if the identifications change, there's a way of putting the change in and so on. So we developed this database. And then the idea was to go on and then each herbarium specimen be somehow related to GIS, so that you can say, oh, this specimen was collected at such and such a point, and have that appear on a map, so forth. Well, we haven't ever gotten that far, so, but that's that. So that's the next bigger thing. And then my successor, Mark Fishbein, is involved with carrying the databasing even farther. And you'll have to talk to him about all the sorts of things they're doing, but trying to extract information in different ways from the herbarium specimens.
When somebody goes out to collect specimens for a herbarium, what's the process?
Okay. Did you ever take your mother a flower, find out she put it in the family Bible, and pressed it, and years later showed it to you? It's the exact same technique, except instead of using a book or the Bible to do it, we use newspaper and a wooden frame and absorbent blotters that are 12 and a half inches by 16 inches long. And they have straps so you can press them down tight, but it's exactly the same thing. You take the plant, put it on the newspaper, spread it out, try to make it look as natural as possible. Some people can do it and have something that looks lifelike, even though it's been pressed flat and dried. And then put it in these absorbent blotters to draw the moisture out. We even have special cabinets that have heaters in them that will dry the specimen. Dry them for 2 or 3 days, then take them out, and then mount them on a sheet of paper with just Elmer's glue or something equivalent, and put a label on them that says where they were collected, when they were collected, the ecology of the area, the morphological features that might not be visible when it's pressed and dried, and then any other pertinent information and the collector's name. And that becomes a permanent record of that particular plant. And so Linnaeus, the famous classifier from the 1700s, a number of years ago, I was trying to understand what Indian grass, our state grass, was, Sargastrum nutans. I was able to go to the Royal Linnean Society in London. You go into a room, go down, and you tell the guard what specimen you want to look at. He goes down to the vaults, brings up Linnaeus' specimen that was collected by Peter Kalm in the early 1700s. And so I was able to look at that specimen and know exactly what Linnaeus had in mind when he described Indian grass. The reason why that specimen became important was that Linnaeus was kind of preceded us in using a computer with cut and paste. He worked so fast that sometimes it was obvious he was cutting and pasting, the equivalent of cutting and pasting one description and putting it in another one and making a mistake. And that's happened a few times. But that's the value of that specimen. A number of years ago, there was a zinc smelter in Bartlesville, and there was a question about how much contamination had been released. They came and looked at the herbarium specimens that had been collected in that area prior to the smelter, took a little snippet and did an analysis of whatever the toxic compounds were, and were able to say, here's our baseline, here's what it was like now, and here's what it is now. So the specimen can be valuable in that way. If the specimen's been dried properly, often you can get DNA from it today and have an idea of what its relationship is.
So the practice of the collecting hasn't really changed much.
No, it started. The earliest, the technique I just described to you, actually started in about 1550. Two Italians, Cisalpinio, and some of his cohorts at the University of Padua. I'm not sure if I say it correctly, and the University of Pisa. They're the ones that came up with the idea of pressing, having specimens for references. They were interested in the plants because of their medicinal properties and wanted their students to be able to see the plants when they weren't in flower or weren't, or dormant or something like that. Linnaeus is the one that came along and came up with the idea of taking them out of books and keeping them separate so you could sort them around depending upon how you classified them. So we've been doing that for more than 4 centuries now, right? 15, 19, yeah. More than.
Looking at the OSU collection, are there any specimens or people that have made donations in the past that really just stand out to you?
Right. G.W. Stevens, the fellow that I told you about that collected in the early 1900s for part of his doctoral dissertation. That's a major collection. And what's interesting, and those specimens have gone all over the world. When I was at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Sydney, Australia, work on a sabbatic leave, I was working on the plants of Oklahoma, and I'd go to their collections, and lo and behold, there were some of the G.W. Stevens. He had a very distinctive label. There were some of his collections there. And then, of course, at Kew in England and London, his collections were there. So G.W. Stevens, many of Waterfall's students, they deposited their collections here. Charles Wallace, who did the Ozark Plateau, did collections there. Featherly's collection of the grasses, very important. And then the various students that I've had do master's studies, floras of interesting botanical or geological regions, or in some cases counties. Their collections are deposited here. But G.W. Stevens would be a big one. George Wallace would be another one. Those are the two that come to mind. Well, Jim McPherson, the ecologist, was doing a study of Black Mesa. His collections are here. Those would be the big ones that I can think of right offhand. Probably as soon as we finish talking today, I'll think of more that I meant to tell you.
Well, we could add them in if you come to mind. You also mentioned that we have some out-of-state specimens in the collection.
Yes.
Do we know how some of them have ended up here at OSU?
The specimens from outside the state, some are due to collectors. Waterfall was a specialist on the nightshade family, the Solanaceae. He did a lot of collecting in Mexico, and he deposited those specimens in the herbarium here. So that's how some of them ended up. Others are through an exchange program. In order to increase the diversity of plants within the herbarium, and they increase the diversity of an individual species so we can see the range of variation in a species, we have an exchange program with herbaria. Like we used to exchange extensively with Fort Towson State University in Maryland. They'd send us 150 specimens at a time that their taxonomists had collected, and I in turn would send them 150 back. So there's this exchange program among different universities. The Smithsonian, I set a lot of grasses there. So there's an exchange program among different herbaria throughout the country, to a lesser extent throughout the world. And as a result, another way that we get specimens, a lot of times when there are projects that have been done for federal agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers or the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they do collecting in Arkansas on the McClellan-Kerr waterway. They'll deposit those specimens here as well as in a Arkansas herbarium just to have distributed about the country. So we've gotten some of our collections from projects such as that, or the Fish and Wildlife Service, or agronomists will deposit voucher specimens that document their research, and they'll often be from various places. At one time, there's a rather extensive collection from Ethiopia. OSU had a exchange program with Ethiopian agronomists, and so a lot of specimens came in on that program and were deposited here. So they come from everywhere, sometimes lots and sometimes just a few.
And are there any guidelines? Do you ever say, no, we don't want said specimen, or? Never say no to specimens, but sometimes we try to tactfully say, maybe not quite so many, because the person who's sending them this is a very nasty way of describing something, is a hay baler. Remember I said some people can make a plant look like it's natural, as if it was still living right there on the page, and other people literally just put it in and press it flat and it looks like a pile of hay. Or you know how when you're mowing the grass and there's tall grass, you get a clump of clippings there, and their specimens look like that. And those are of no value, scientific value, as well as aesthetic value. And so often we accept them, but we try to discourage any more of those. Try to politely say, please send me your most unusual things that show the most characters and so forth. Some take the hint and some don't. So. What are some of the oldest specimens in the collection?
All right. The oldest specimen that I've encountered, and I am embarrassed to say I forgot, is 1846. Obviously not collected by anyone here in Oklahoma. It was on an exchange. I think it came from the U.S. National Herbarium, from the Smithsonian. But for the life of me, I've tried for quite a while to remember. I should have written it down at the time. I thought, this is really neat. I'll remember this. And then I immediately forgot it. But I do remember 1846. But there are quite a few from the late 1800s in there. You can go in and, especially in the grasses. A.S. Hitchcock, the famous grass taxonomist who worked at the Smithsonian with Agnes Chase, who has sometimes been referred to as the first grass lady of the United States. We got a lot of their specimens on exchange, and they were collecting in the 1800s.
Does the herbarium often see researchers or requests for specimens? How?
Yes, we have an active program of loaning specimens to taxonomists at other universities, especially with the Flora of North America project, where a specialist in a particular group of plants working at, say, North Carolina State University will say, would you please send us all your specimens of that particular species, so that when we write our description for all of North America, we'll be able to describe the total range of variation. And so, depending upon the time, a loan can be anywhere from 20 or 30 specimens to several hundred specimens that we loan to other herbaria. And then when they finish them, they annotate them and send them back to us. Sometimes it's just Oklahoma specimens they want to look at. Sometimes it's everything that we have that they want to look at. Likewise, we're borrowing specimens from elsewhere, and usually the graduate students or faculty are studying. When I had a graduate student working on the genus Papaphorum, it occurs in southwestern United States, but its center of distribution is actually South America. And so we wrote Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and asked to borrow their specimens. And we had several hundred specimens of Papaphorum from South America that we were looking at, so we could understand what the North American species, how they were related. So yeah, there's constantly, and that's one of the nice things that the department has supported. They support the mailing costs on those. And that sometimes can run into several $100 mailing specimens to and from various institutions.
Are environmental conditions within a building an issue? Do you have to keep specimens at a certain temperature, or?
Okay. The biggest issue, I think, and my successor has managed to make some progress in getting that under control, is the humidity. Mm-hmm. The specimens are kept in dust-proof, light-proof cabinets. And if they're kept there and water doesn't get to them and insects don't get to them, they'll last indefinitely. I talked about looking at Linnaeus' specimens. And the specimens from the 1500s are still available and still in usable condition. So that's the biggest issue, is keeping the humidity at bay. Now some bigger herbaria, like the Missouri Botanical Garden, OU, because they had money to do it, they have a completely separate air handling system. Now at Kew, where I worked on 3 somatics, their specimens were just kept in ordinary rooms. The windows, we opened the windows to get circulation in the building and so forth. The insects weren't a problem. The biggest problem are not living insects. It's the ones that feed on dead plant material. They're called cigarette beetles. There's a special name for them. And they're the ones, before any specimen goes into the herbarium, it's put in a deep freeze for at least a week to kill the insects and to kill any larvae that might, or eggs that might be there. So the biggest problem would be insects, and the second, I think, is humidity, because sometimes using a herbarium specimen, it just, that's why I've got the little one. I'm down here. You could probably tell when you came in here. You gotta have air moving in order to sometimes stand it down here. The humidity gets so bad. But no, in terms of highly specialized environment, no. The Missouri Botanical Garden, they have their compactors. Kew, the new wings, they keep the specimens at a low temperature. You have to put on an overcoat to go in and get the specimens, bring them back out to look at them and so forth. Defeats the whole purpose of being able to have ready access to the specimens.
Are there any faculty members on campus or other researchers that have taken advantage of the herbarium's collection that come to mind?
Oh, Yep. Fish and wildlife people, they're often in looking at our seed and fruit collection to identify the seeds and fruits that they find either in the guts of their animals or caught in the fur or feathers and so forth. The weed scientists come over, bring their plants over, and say, we've got this new weed, what is it? Or a lot of the identification is indirect. I'll get a request from an extension agent in Cotton County down in the southwest. We've got this weed in the field. Can you tell me what it is? And they used to send the specimens in, but now with the advent of the digital camera, if they can get a reasonably good picture, I can use the herbarium collections to get it identified. I might have a good idea, but I need to go look. So indirectly, the herbarium is serving as a way of identifying their plants. I'll get something, well, this looks like something, but it's not this, and I'll go in and just start browsing through the cabinets until looking at things that I think it might be, and often we'll run across it. The turf people in horticulture, they'll bring their samples in and look at specimens to see if we can match up plants in terms of their vegetative characters. The toxicologist out at the Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab, before I retired, Fishbein gets them now, I used to come around the corner there, and there would be 3 or 4 sacks full of plants of things wanting to know, are any of these toxic? We've got a problem in cattle that's producing these symptoms. Are any of these a possibility? And so, yeah, a lot of people, the people in, trying to think, where entomology from some time will come look at specimens. They have a particular insect that's a problem. They want to know what plant it's on, and so they'll come check. So we do a lot of identifications. I used to do on the order anywhere from 150 to 200 identifications a year. I'd turn in that was part of my annual A&D. What went under the heading of extension, my outreach activities, identifying plants for the public. Or I have someone call and said, I'm out here at the rest area on I-35. I've just come into the state, and here are all these trees that have got tiny cream-colored flowers. What do you think I'm seeing? And then I'd ask them a couple of questions. Well, it turns out it's soapberry in flower, Sapindus drumundii. Or the one invariably, every fall, someone will call and say, I'm out here in the woods, walking through the woods, and there's a stalk with no leaves that's got orange berries clustered all over the end of it. And I would say, you're probably looking at either green dragon or jack in the pulpit, Erythema dracontium or Erythema triphyllum, because that's so distinctive in the fall of the year. And the leaves are dropping, and you can see quite a ways through that bright orange. They're the color of an orange, really orange color. They'll see that, and they'll immediately go over and want to know what it is. And by that time, the leaves are gone entirely, and it's just the fruit. So there's this naked stalk. So.
Well, looking back on your time as curator of the herbarium, anything really just stand out that you're very proud of during your tenure?
Things I'm proud. One, I think the thing I'm most proud about with respect to the herbarium, and is probably the least exciting thing of all, is that during my tenure as curator, I've made the collection more usable. As I said a little while ago, when I first came, those pigeonholes in the cabinets were so jam-packed, you couldn't get the specimens out without hearing crunch, crackle, crackle, the specimens breaking apart. They were in the folders they were in. You didn't really know what was in the folder. And by increasing the size of the collection, or the number of cabinets. Oh, that's what I forgot. When we moved down from the fourth floor down to the basement, I didn't have to move the cabinets. Physical plant has to move. And there's 2 or 3 fellows on the moving crew that still remember. This was in '84. They still remember carrying those cabinets down the stairs because they'd taken out the big, enormous freight elevator and put in a passenger elevator. Well, the cabinets wouldn't fit in it. They had to hand carry those from the 4th floor down. And when you see the cabinets, you'll appreciate why it was such a task. Bring them in. We switched from one type of classification to another, the Engler-Prandtl system, which dates to the 1800s, with the Cronquist system, which at the time was the system to have. So we got it updated in terms of how the specimens are arranged. But the specimens, by curating them, going through repairing the ones that were bad, repairing them, the ones that were totally destroyed and even the labels weren't legible anymore, upgrading those. That's what I'm proud of. I made that herbarium where it'll hopefully last a couple of more 100 years, sort of thing. I don't know. Everything will be digital by then and they'll throw the specimens away. I hope not, but that's the thing, the digital imaging. Everything. You can go online and look at specimens. You can't. They're not the same as looking at the real plant, though. Bellamy Parks Jansen wouldn't have been able to draw the plants she drew and with the detail if she had to use a photograph or a digital image and so forth. And what's interesting, when she was drawing a lot of those things, she saw things and brought to our attention things we'd always taken for granted and had really looked at them carefully. And that was because there was a specimen that she could take a flower off and dissect it under a dissecting scope and really appreciate just how fine it was. So that's what I'm proud of, making the collection more usable.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the herbarium before we move on?
I thought of 2 things.
Great.
One, the herbarium has 2 other things that are very much a part of it. One is called the type collection. Whenever a species new to science is described, there's a requirement that a physical specimen be designated the type specimen or holotype. And that specimen is always associated with that name from now until the end of eternity. Okay. End of eternity? That'd really be even beyond eternity. All right, to the end. That's why Linnaeus' specimen was so important. I could determine exactly what he had in mind when he described Sargastrium nutans. Well, we have a collection of about 100 type specimens. Not all of them are from Oklahoma, some of them are, but we have that as part of the collection. They're maintained in a separate cabinet. And they're not just brought out for anyone to look at. They have to have a legitimate reason for looking at it. So that's a very important part of the collection. The second thing is, it's not very extensive, but we have a collection of field notebooks. We have Robert Stratton's field notebooks, so we know where he was on such and such a date. And those are, they probably, you'd say they actually belong in the library, in the archives or something, and maybe Mark Fishbein will move them over there, but that would be part of that. And then the collection that Sheila's working with him on being deposited in the herbarium here, the value of something like that. Then the fruit and seed collection is extremely valuable. As I mentioned before, there's been countless hours spent by graduate students sitting here trying to match up what came out of the intestine of a deer with a particular species and so forth. And that's possible because of the collection that was started by Stratton in the 1930s and then expanded by me and by others, and Featherly in particular. So we have those two things. So collection, and then we have a collection of mosses and liverworts and lichens that, as far as I know, it's really the mosses and liverworts would be down at OU as well, but the lichens, I think it's the only collection in the state. And so that would be an attribute of the herbarium as well.
If you had to guess, how many specimens have you deposited? Estimate.
Not that many, because I was doing other things. On the order, I'd be lucky if I could say 1,500. Because I'm embarrassed to say, I just never really had the time or took the time to do extensive collecting. It was easier to send the graduate students out to do the collecting rather than me collecting personally. No, I know it's over 1,000 because I've got my field notebook in there. I remember it. Yeah, it would be over 1,000, but not as many as 1,500, I don't think.
Well, you mentioned a lot of the books you've written. What has been kind of your main area of focus here in Oklahoma?
Okay. In terms of research activities, I consider myself a plant taxonomist. I'm interested in identification and classification. So the big project, of course, is the Flora of Oklahoma project that will still be going on once a month, long after I'm long gone. But we've made a good start on it, so that it's that's identification of the state. If someone wants to know how to identify the state's plants, that's how I can do it. As I mentioned a moment ago, I'm very interested in the grass family. And I and my cohort down at OU, we actually wrote a book, a manual for the identification of the state's grasses. Got it all the way done, and then decided that we didn't like the way we'd done it. I took a sabbatic leave and started to do it all over using a different approach and never got back to it. And what we did, and then the Flora of Oklahoma project got started, so we decided rather than do it all over, we'll just take what we have, incorporate that into the Flora of Oklahoma project. So got that. While we were doing that, we edited 2 books on the grasses and grasslands of Oklahoma. One was published by the OU Press, the other was published by the Noble Foundation. We organized 2 symposia. In the proceedings of those symposia, we edited the symposia and then published those. And then I got off on toxic plants with my associate out in the vet school, a toxicologist, George Burroughs. And we did the first the little one, Oklahoma, Toxic Plants of Oklahoma. Then we did the first edition of Toxic Plants of North America. And then we did, turned it around, and instead of, we did it by symptoms. So if you have an animal that's showing a particular set of symptoms, what would be the plants that you need to look, check, and see if they're around? I've forgotten why we titled that. It's just toxic syndromes caused by plants or something like that. So we did that. And then we had the second edition of Toxic Plants of North America. And then we did a whole series, slug of chapters on toxic plants for various encyclopedias and symposia and so forth. One of my graduate students identified the toxic compound in the narrow-leaved milkweeds. Most milkweeds you've heard, possibly heard, are cardiotoxic. You know, the monarch butterflies feed on the plants, sequester the cardiotoxins, and that makes them toxic to birds that attempt to eat them. Have you heard that story?
No.
Okay. Well, most milkweeds are cardiotoxic, but there's one group that are especially neurotoxic. Well, the toxic compound had never been identified. And one of my field botany students wanted to do a master's with me, and she learned all the chemical techniques to isolate that compound and identify it. And we published a paper, well, actually a chapter on the identification of the compound. So intermixed, and then people in agronomy and range science. Oh, the field guide, I forgot the field guide, the first edition and second edition of the field guide. And then several people in agronomy asked me to contribute chapters on various agronomic plants and weeds and so forth. And then I was involved with an agronomist, a grass breeder. We took 2 trips to China to collect germplasm of Old World blue stems and Bermuda grass. And I was involved in that and the publications on that. So a little bit of everything, whatever. Whenever someone approached me, I guess I wasn't really much of an initiator. People would approach me, say, "Can you help me?" And then I forgot. Dye plants. Lynn Richards in Human Environmental Sciences approached me with a project. She was interested in the plants Native Americans used when the introduced tribes came to Oklahoma or Indian Territory. She went through the pioneer papers and pulled out all the plants that were used as dye plants. Well, she didn't know one plant from another, and so she invited me to help her. I started out by helping identify the plants she was interested in, and then we started collecting the plants and seeing if we could duplicate the colors, and we wrote a book, Native Dye Plants, North American Native Dye Plants, or Native Dye Plants of the Southern Plains. I've forgotten the title, and we published that, and Timber Press published that. So, yeah, people came to me and said, "Would you help me with this?" And pretty soon I'm involved in it, and something comes out of it.
That's good. And still, you're still busy.
I'm still busy, but I'm getting close to the end.
Have you ever been involved with any conservation efforts or native plant legislation?
But you never ask. The Oklahoma Native Plant Societies. I'm one of the founders of the Oklahoma Native Plant Society. I was one of the first board members. I was involved in its formation in 1987. Again, I wasn't the instigator, but they pulled me into it. So I've been involved in the Oklahoma Native Plant Society from the very beginning, served on the board almost continually until essentially till I retired. And then I got involved in Color Oklahoma, which is the program. It's an offshoot. It was independent, and now it's an offshoot of the Native Plant Society to beautify our Oklahoma roadsides by planting native wildflowers. Perhaps you've seen the Color Oklahoma license plates, the ones that say WF and then the number, and there's a big gaillardia on them. Well, I'm been serving on that since 2006 on that. So Native Plant Society, I've written a number of articles for the Native Plant Society Journal, the Oklahoma Native Plant Society Journal, and also for the newsletter, the Gaillardia. It's easy for me to write. In fact, the one I just did for the Oklahoma Native Plant Record was on the history of field botanists in Oklahoma. And so did that one. And then a couple of years ago I wrote it's called the Critic's Choice Essay, wrote the essay on how to identify plants. And then for the Gaillardia, when they're desperate for someone to write a column, I write about toxic plants like poison ivy or nettles or things like that, the stinging plants. So that's what my research has been. When I was hired, they envisioned me being a cytogeneticist and working on the cytology and genetics of plant species. And I never really did a thing with cytogenetics and done all these other things.
You've also been involved with many professional organizations.
Oklahoma Academy of Science. I was president of that several years back. Southwestern Association of Naturalists. Which is both botanists and zoologists, and as the name implies, the southwestern quarter of the U.S. I was the secretary for it and on the board of it for several years. And then I've been trying to think of another society I've been involved with professional societies like American Society of Plant Taxonomists, Botanical Society of America. Those would be the two big ones there. But I've never held an office. I enjoyed going to the meetings, but never got actively involved in them.
When you look back on your career here at OSU, what legacy do you hope to leave for others in the profession?
The legacy for others. My legacy, and the students make fun of me. Former students make fun of me for it, because when we were driving, I'd be driving that bus down the road, and they'd want to sleep, and I had a PA system, and I'd be going along, and I'd say, notice the change. Because when we make a transition from one vegetation to another, you can see the change because of the change in the species or the change in the topography or so forth. So notice the change. Or I'd say, there's an old friend. Can you recognize it? And of course it's going by at 70 miles an hour, 60 miles, 55 in those days, 55 miles an hour. And I think the legacy I'll have former students come up to me and say, I haven't been able to drive down the road and just see green anymore. I have to look at the plants and I think about them as I drive down the road. And so that's my legacy. If I've got my students, whether in field botany or in general botany or any of the other courses that I've taught, to just see the plant as an individual, I'm pleased at my legacy. And my reward is when they come back to me and tell me that they can't avoid seeing the change and they can't avoid seeing the individual plants. So, is that a legacy?
Sure.
That's my legacy.
That's wonderful. Is there anything else we've missed? Anything else you want to tell us before we close out?
I can't think of anything right offhand. Oh, I will, just as a general aside, my wife and I came here. We weren't really sure about Oklahoma. In fact, I still remind her that when we drove into Oklahoma the first time we came down to look for a house, she grew up in northwest Missouri, about 2 hours north of Kansas City, and was used to trees and rolling hills and so forth. And she had this vision. She now knows she was wrong, that Oklahoma was flat as could be and there were no trees. But when we came down I-35 and passed from Kansas into Oklahoma, tears came to her eyes, and she was thinking, and we came down in July, and it was 100 and something those days, and she was pretty distraught about, what have you driven me to? And that's when she coined the phrase, you're coming home to die, like a lemming, and so forth. So, but we thought, well, we'll be here 6 years or so. We really missed Oregon, and I even applied for a position out in Oregon after we'd been here 5 or 6 years, and made the finalists but didn't get it. And then the biological station started. We started spending the summers here. And all in all, even though we miss Oregon, and we had 3 wonderful sabbatic, or 4 wonderful sabbatic leaves. My mate, the department head, Glenn Todd at the time, I was starting to suffer burnout in 81, 82, and he kept urging me to take a sabbatic leave. And I finally got up the gumption to do it. Took the first one, 83, 84, to the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew in London. We borrowed the money and went for 8 months, squeezed it in between the biological station the 1 year, and then got back in time to teach at the biological station again the next year. And I told people, I said, I've done 6 years of penance for a year of pleasure, because I felt like I got more done. I was working on the grass floor of Oklahoma that year than I had in all the previous years at OSU. And so when the 7 years came up and I could go again in 90, we went, and this time we left the minute school was out in the fall or in the spring here, and didn't come back until a week before school started in the fall. And then in 97, 98, we did the same thing again. And then they wanted me to come back to Kew in 95, but when I was at Kew in 83, 84, the Australian liaison botanist invited me to come to Sydney. And so I called him up and said, after 20 years of consideration, I'll take you up on your offer. Can I come? And so we figured we'd go to Australia, and I could work there and we'd see Australia. And so OSU, although it's been frustrating at times, provided 4 memorable years of experience. The biological station, those 20-some summers of memorable experiences. And so, all in all, it's been a good time. Been frustrating. Sometimes got pretty aggravated. But we thought maybe if we don't like it, we'll be here 6 years, and if it doesn't work out, I'll go back to either driving a Coke truck or working for Safeway. You know, I wasn't worried about that.
It's been a good career.
It's
been a good career.
It's been a good career, and so forth. And no regrets, really. There might have been some, if I had my druthers, I might have done something a little bit different, but no regrets. So, and that's why I'm still here, fooling with stuff. My wife says, just because you've gotten in the habit and can't quit, and everybody says that, oh, you'll never quit. So, we'll see.
Well, thank you so much for your time.